Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing, well, we're doing some power building, which I don't often do on this channel. I don't explicitly go out of my way to power build, and this build isn't really that either. It's just that when I finished making the build and got to testing, I kind of realised how powerful it actually was. Basically, I started off this concept of wanting to make a wizard build, a build that was predominantly wizard, because I haven't done that in a hot minute, but I didn't really know what I wanted the theme of the build to be. So I ended up deciding to try to adapt a kind of classic trope, that being just the idea of dark magic. You know, when you think of like the evil wizards, you know what they end up using, and it's just this kind of more ambiguous magic that, you know, is just used for evil purposes. And then, you know, that got me thinking, okay, well, what is the definition of dark magic in D&D/Baldur's Gate 3? And in my opinion, that's Eldritch Blast. So in the end, I knew I wanted to make a wizard that used Eldritch Blast as kind of their bread and butter cantrip, and what I ended up making in the end was just something kind of stupid. You'll see what I mean as we kind of get into the video, but let's just say you're probably just seen in the combat footage that this build does end up one-shotting some late game enemies on Tactician. Overall, again, not usually the type of thing I try to build, but it ended up being a very, very fun kind of thing. And combining it with some of the new spells that we get from like Mistress and stuff like that, going for powerful evocation spells to just go for like this destructive force of just that wields like powerful dark evocation magic. It just felt really fun to play. So I figured, why not? I'm just going to show this build off. I mean, I'm probably not the first person to do something like this. Hell, I know I'm not. But I still just wanted to kind of show off what I did here and kind of give like the thematic and lore reasons behind it. So first off, we are going to be kicking things off as a half-elf, and this is actually quite important for the build. In order to get kind of the most effectiveness out of this build, you want to make sure you're playing a half-elf or a human for shield proficiency. I want to use a shield on this build somehow to be able to gain a boost to AC. Another kind of sub-goal I had for this build was just to get a lot of AC to compensate for a slightly lower constitution score. Since we're going for mostly wizard levels and having a middling constitution means that we're going to have a very small hit point pool at level 12 compared to most other builds. I wanted to make it so we were extremely hard to hit, and well, this build ends on 23 AC total before things like shield and such like that, so this job was definitely accomplished, and a shield is definitely going to help with that, so we want to absolutely make sure that we have one to use. Not 100% required, but if you really want to go for that high kind of AC, I definitely think it's worth it. I went with half-elf overall because that means we get to play as a high half-elf, which means we get an extra wizard cantrip, so I thought that would be worth picking up, but you can go for pretty much any race as long as it's half-elf or human. You can pick any of the sub-races, it doesn't really matter. But this is also going to get us Fey Ancestry, so we have advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and magic cannot put us to sleep. I felt like this actually worked interestingly for the kind of lore that I have for this character, which we'll get to in a moment. Next up, Dark Vision, always great to have, as well as the Civil Militia feature, which is what allows us to use shields as well as light armor, although we are going to be using mage armor for this build. We also gain weapon proficiency with spears, pikes, halberds, and glaives, so if you want to go for some two-handed weapon shenanigans, you can, but just know that our physical stats aren't exactly going to be the greatest unless you're going to try and go for finesse. Moving on, like I say, we are a high half-elf for my days, allowing us to pick an extra cantrip. Obviously, pick whatever you like here, it really doesn't matter. We're going to have the opportunity to pick up a lot of different cantrips throughout this build's life cycle, so feel free to kind of choose what you like here. I went with Friends because, you know, it's one of the better single-choice cantrips you can get. It just has so much effective usage across the game, and since we are going to have a really high charisma stat with this build, it's going to make you just the face of the party, just in every way possible. Moving on, for our starting class, we are actually going to go with Warlock, which will get us access to simple weapons and light armor. We already gained light armor from being a half-elf, but simple weapons is what we're really after. Although you can start as a wizard as well, but I do think getting the Eldritch Blast from Warlock early on to kind of get the baseline playstyle that we're going for is going to be better in the long run, so that is what my personal pick will be. But long story short, by starting off as a Warlock, we get immediate access to Eldritch Blast, which again is what we want to be our main bread and butter cantrip for this build, as well as an extra cantrip of our choice. You know, we can get for Mage Hand, any of the Mistress spells cantrips that strike your fancy. I do think we will be getting Mind Sliver at some point in this build, but I think I'm going to take that from the Wizard spell list instead. So it's kind of up to you, like, which way you want to go about things, but we definitely want to make sure we get Eldritch Blast as early on as we can, and Mage Hand is a great utility cantrip to have have throughout the entire game, so I want to pick it up here. Now for our subclass, you kind of do have free choice here. Obviously the Fiend can work nicely for the charisma-based, temporary hit points, although we will gain another source of temporary hit points, and the Fiend is based on your total Warlock level, so it won't actually work that well for us in the long run. Archfey does work if you want to go for like charming and beguiling magics, and obviously if you are using mods, the Celestial mod is available on all platforms, which would give us access to healing and like radiant damage and such like that. But I do think the Great Old One makes the most sense for this build, and let me explain why. The kind of background I had for this character is, and the kind of reason for going down the path of using maybe slightly darker magics, is the fact that they are a young wizard. They are maybe studying in some sort of academy, maybe the one down at Waterdeep. Hell, maybe Gale is their teacher. Maybe they come from a long line of prestigious magic casters, but they themselves just are not that adept at it. Despite their tries, despite their struggles, they just cannot seem to master magic beyond the very basics. A few cantrips here and there, and maybe the occasional level 1 spell, but they can never really find their appropriate school or just find their stride in magic. Despite being a half-elf, they just have such difficulty with it beyond the basics. And this frustration builds and builds and builds into hours of endless nights of study over various magical tomes to reaching the breaking point of their psyche where they just have had enough, and that is when they are approached by something older than magic itself. This dark force, this dark entity begins to influence their mind, giving them access to a new spellbook that is dark in nature, somewhat inspired by the Darkhold from Marvel. And it's this very spellbook that when they read from it, they're able to access dark eldritch magic and able to enhance the spells of the mortal world in new ways. So that's kind of my flavouring for how this build came about, and this totally isn't because I've been doing a lot of Call of Cthulhu stuff again lately, particularly finally finishing my own Call of Cthulhu one-shot that we did for that charity stream, which will be uploaded to the channel soon because it is awesome. Hopefully either the same day this video goes up or the day after, so keep an eye on the channel for a very big video of mine. But anyways, I do think the Great Old One, thematically, lore-wise, and mechanically is going to work the best for this build. Not only are we going to get access to some fun psychic spells, while not being Evocation, which is what we're mainly going to be going for here, thanks to Eldritch Blast and such like that, are still very useful and have some utility, so if you want to pick these up as part of your spell list, you absolutely can. But the core feature here is more to a reminder. Whenever you land a critical hit against a creature, that creature and any nearby enemies must succeed a wisdom saving throw or become frightened until the end of their next turn. Now, we're not necessarily going to be specifically going for a critical hit reduction gear in this build, like I do whenever I try to take advantage of stuff like this, but the fact that we're going to be making so many attacks in a turn with something like Eldritch Blast being able to hit up to 3 times, your likelihood of rolling a critical hit because it's each separate attack rolls is a bit higher, so I do think that this will go off a little more often than you will expect, but not as often as if we were to deliberately spec into it. But since it's the most likely to be useful out of all of the level 1 features here that the subclasses could potentially provide, and this is the subclass I wanted to use for lore reasons, I do think the Mortimer Rider is a good feature to have. Moving on to the level 1 spells, you do have a few options here. Again, we're using the Mistress Spells mod like I do in all of my builds, which is available to all platforms. Now, I would say it's kind of up to you what you want to pick here. I definitely recommend Hex for an early powerful concentration spell, which is just going to add an additional 1d6 necrotic damage to a target of our choosing whenever we hit them with an attack, and again, this will work with Eldritch Blast quite nicely. So your other spells are entirely up to you. Dissonant Whispers for an additional fear aspect does feel like it works nicely on this build and definitely fits into that dark magic theme, but something like Bane, Tasha's Hideous Laughter, Arms of Hadar all work really, really well. I do quite like Dissonant Whispers more, though, just because I feel like the psychic damage not often being resisted does feel pretty nice. Arms of Hadar, though, definitely does fit the theme, and I would say you could take that if you really want to lean into the Cthulian aspect, which, now that I think about it, I probably will. And this does kind of give you a decent option for close range if enemies do get up close to you, which also prevents them from using reactions, allowing you to back up and get into a better situation where you can use Eldritch Blast more effectively at range. So actually, now that I think about it, Arms of Hadar probably is what I would pick here, but feel free to swap that out. Moving on to our ability scores, it looks like they got changed about from what they should be, so I'll quickly fix that now. But basically what you're going to want is either intelligence or charisma at 17, and then have the other one be at 16. In my testing, I actually did have intelligence at 17, but I think with the level progression of this build, I think going for the 17 in charisma and the 16 in intelligence is the better way to go. As for our dexterity, we are going to leave that at 8 because we do have to use the gloves of dexterity to make this build work. In order to get the most power possible out of our features and abilities, we are going to want to we're going to have to dump one of our usual core stats, and since dexterity does have the gloves of dex to help with this, it makes the most sense to dump that, since you can get it very early on in the game. I would say maybe you could try dumping like either probably intelligence, as you're kind of in the early levels of the game, around levels, and maybe up until level 4 when you're more likely to get the gloves of dex, and then respec after. But for now, the gloves of you don't even really need your dexterity that much in the early game anyway. As long as you manage to stay back and out of the way, you're not really going to have to worry about enemy attacks because you can attack from such a far distance and you can rely on your teammates. But again, I think most people who play this game will know that you can kind of just take away one of the 2 spellcasting stats you're going to be using less, and if you're using mainly utility spells from Wizard in the early game, you don't really need your intelligence at all, so you can just focus on charisma, dex, and con, and then respec later. But for now, this is kind of what your final starting stats are going to look like. 8 in strength because we don't need it, constitution at 14, would have this higher if possible, but really this is a fine ability score for the amount of AC we're going to be having, and concentration isn't a huge deal on this build. A lot of what we do is just straight up evocation, with some concentration options here and there like hacks, but otherwise you don't have to worry about that much because if you play this build correctly, you're not really going to be close enough for enemies to give you much trouble anyway, and we'll have many different ways to make it so that we're going to be not being hit by many attacks. Intelligence is at 16, obviously it's going to be our wizard spellcasting stat. Wisdom is at 10, I didn't want this to be at 8 because I do think any spellcaster is more likely to have a little bit more common sense than the average person, but this dude also did make a pact with a dark eldritch being, so I don't think his wisdom is going to be the highest. And charisma is at 17 because we're going to be bumping this up with a half feat later. Moving on to skill proficiencies, I've gone for the sage background because obviously we study magic, we're trying our hardest to study magic, so I think it makes sense that we take the sage background, giving us access to arcana and history. I've also gone for deception and intimidation as our kind of charisma social stats here, meaning that we're going to be lying and scaring people into getting what we want, although we're going to be decent at persuasion anyway. Overall, because of the way our stats work out, us having an eventual 18 in dexterity and the high spellcasting stats as well, I think we actually have a very well-rounded selection here of skill proficiencies. So overall, we're looking pretty good even just at level 1. At level 2, we are going to stick with Warlock for a few reasons, the obvious one being the Eldritch Invocations, giving us access to Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast to augment our Eldritch Blast. Agonizing Blast giving it more powerful, giving it more power, equal to our Charisma modifier, as well as Repelling Blast allowing us to push enemies away so we can move away without having to disengage, which is quite nice. We're also going to be able to pick up an extra level 1 spell, entirely up to you what you want to pick here, it really doesn't matter. I like Hellish Rebuke as a counter attack that's also an evocation spell. I think it works quite nice, so I think we're going to grab that here. But also another really good reason to go to level 2 of Warlock in spite of all this is getting that second Warlock spell slot. We now have 2 level 1 Warlock spell slots, which may not seem like a lot, but when you realise that as we level up as a wizard, we're going to have a lot of useful utility level 1 spells, especially Shield, we now have access to those twice per short rest, which is actually really solid. Shield, especially getting that sort of benefit, is huge, so I'm quite happy to have that here. Moving on to Warlock level 3, which we're not actually taking. We're going to go straight to Wizard, and we're going to stay there. We're going to be going for Wizard for the rest of our levels here, picking up key spells along the way, and our subclass features, we want all 3 of them, so we need to go to level 10. So, moving on, we get to pick our Wizard cantrips, and at this point, you've got quite a few good options to you. I think Mind Sliver is going to be a great cantrip to take on this build. It's psychic damage, which is not often resisted, and you can throw, basically by throwing a psychic spike into the creature's mind, you inflict a negative d4 penalty to saving throws until the end of their next turn. So basically, a lot of our spells, like kind of our early game stuff, is going to rely on saving throws, and eventually when we do get our big blast spells, like something like Fireball, for example, those are saving throw based as well. This is going to make it so our enemies are much less likely to succeed. So being able to throw in a quick cantrip to set up up for your big evocation spell on the next round is really good. But of course, this is until the end of our next turn, so any of our allies who are inflicting these saving throws as well are also going to be gaining the benefit. So overall, it's just a great damaging cantrip. Obviously, if we're going for pure damage, we're going to be using Eldritch Blast, but if we want a bit of that utility while still getting a bit of damage in, this is going to be great. I'm also going to be picking up Toll the Dead because if we're talking about dark magic, this feels just at home. It's a 1d8 necrotic damage spell which would turn into 1d12 if the target is below its maximum hit points, which in most cases it will be. Up to you if you want to pick this or not, but otherwise it does fit the theme quite nicely. And finally, you can kind of pick up another utility cantrip. It's entirely up to you kind of what you want to grab. Bone Chill is great if you want to make it so that undead or any target can't benefit from healing, which can be very, very useful in certain encounters, and undead targets have disadvantage on the attack rolls against this one, have disadvantage on their attack rolls. Keep flubbing my commentary today, but we're just going to push through. So yeah, I feel like this is a solid kind of option here. Maybe Toll the Dead in addition to Bone Chill is a bit of overkill, so you can swap that out for something like maybe Ray of Frost for movement speed, Minor Illusion. You know, you got a few options here. There's even Sapping Sting, which can knock targets prone, which I actually think I might pick up instead. There's definitely a lot of options you can pick here, so feel free to choose. We also have access to 6 prepared spells right at the start that we can pick. So our main spell here is going to be Mage Armour, because yes, we are using an armored defense for this build, and this is going to help us out greatly. For our main kind of attacking spell, if we're not able to use Eldritch Blast for whatever reason, maybe there's something blocking our path, then Magic Missile is going to be the next best thing. It's another multi-hit spell, like Eldritch Blast, which is going to synergize with a few of the pieces of equipment and like sort of subclass abilities that I'll be showing off later, so Magic Missile is going to feel right at home here. And of course, we are grabbing Shield. It's one of the best defensive spells in the game, and thanks to our Warlock spell slots, we're going to be able to use it quite a bit, as well as Absorb Elements. For those things that our AC isn't going to help us with, which are usually AoE elemental attacks, Absorb Elements is going to take the place. As a reaction similar to Shield, you can take half damage from the next elemental attack targeting you, and you deal an additional 1d6 of that element type on your next attack. So it's defensive, it's offensive, and it's really going to help us survive with our squishy wizard HP. Moving on, you get to pick up a couple of more spells as well, and at this point it really is up to you, although I recommend taking as many different evocation spells as possible because they are going to help get over certain damage resistances. Although again, most of the time you are going to be using Eldritch Blast, and Force is not often resisted, so you can kind of feel free to play around with your spell choice here. I'm just going to take things like Featherfall, I think, here as well, because it kind of fits the theme. I don't know, a lot of people who use dark magic tend to listly float down as their menacing cackles fill the room or whatever. You know what I mean, you know, typical D&D bad guy stuff. But also I like things like Catapult here. While not being an evocation spell, I often you know, relate the Great Old One to like psychic stuff, so being able to telekinetically throw things feels like it's on point. There's also things like Cause Fear, Id Insinuation, Magnify Gravity, and Jim's Magic Missile, which is slightly more powerful than the regular Magic Missile, but does come with a potential downside. So again, really up to you here what you want to pick. It really is a pick your favorite type situation. I actually do like Thunderwave here as well. It's kind of a pushing enemies away type deal, because again, Eldritch Blast, if an enemy is right in your face, you will have disadvantage on the attack roll, so maybe something like Thunderwave can be helpful here, and the game has picked this spell selection for us, so I'll keep that. At Wizard level 2, we get to pick our subclass, and of course we're going with Evocation. Evocation is our main spell score that we're going to be using here, and as such we are going to get the Sculpt Spells feature. Create pockets of safety within your Evocation spells. Allies automatically succeed their saving throws against these spells and take no damage from them. So now the party is not going to yell at you for dropping Fireball in a small room, because hey, they're not going to take damage. Moving on, we do get to pick up some more spells, and again, like, you just have so many choices that could really work well for you. Witch Bolt can actually be a powerful evocation spell that you can constantly keep up, although you do have to use your action to recast it, which means less Eldritch Blasting, so it's kind of up to you how you want to play that. We do take some fire spells later on, so something like Burning Hands would feel right at home here. You've got so many different options available to you here. Like, I would just say kind of pick your favorites in any sense. You've just got a lot of options for you. Tasha's Caustic Brew for acid damage can also be really fun. You know, just kind of pick whatever strikes your fancy here. Chromatic Orb, just as an overall dedicated, like, one-size-fits-all type of spell for multiple different damage types. You know, just pick up your favorites. That's what I'm trying to say. Moving on to level 3 of Wizard, we are going to gain access to level 2 spells, which just opens up our options even further. It's entirely up to you kind of what you want to take here as well. I think Scorching Ray is a solid evocation option if you really need it, dealing 66 fire damage, but again, we have Eldritch Blast, and we're probably going to use that more often than not. However, I do recommend picking up the Darkness spell. Although we didn't take Devil's Sight from our Eldritch Invocations, you do have the option to do so, as well as the fact that I'm going to be showing off a piece of equipment that basically does the same thing later on. So Darkness is actually going to be a very useful spell, imposing disadvantage on attack rolls against us. With our high AC, enemies that make regular attack rolls are basically never going to hit us. This is probably going to be your main concentration spell, and at this point we are kind of playing a Warlock without making it mostly Wizard, but hey, that doesn't make it any less fun, and also it's dark magic. Literally, darkness is dark magic. Like, I mean, come on. You gotta let me have that one at least. And we also get to go down here to the Mistress spells for some other interesting options. There's some cool things like Mind Spike, which is a divination spell but does psychic damage. Could be a fun choice. There's things like Agnesar's Scorcher, which is a powerful evocation spell that can work in a line. You've got a few different things here. Again, I like to think maybe take more utility spell options here because, again, Eldritch Blast is our main bread and butter. But you have lots of different options available to you. Things like Hold Person could be very fun. Crown of Madness and Blindness and Cloud of Daggers. You got, in fact, Mirror Image if you want even more AC, can be super strong. Melf's Acid Arrow. There's so many different things available to you here, so again, it's a pick your favorite situation. I'm not going to linger on it too long. I would say even maybe let's slap in, let's drop you for you. At Wizard level 4, we're going to gain access to our first feat at the build. At total level 6, this does feel a little bit awkward, but having effectively a 16 in both of our spellcasting stats is absolutely fine. For our cantrips, we do get to pick another one at this point. Again, it's a pick your favorite situation, take whatever you like, just something with a unique utility effect will always be great. Maybe something like Poison Spray could be fun. Oh, yeah, Poison Spray for 2d12 poison damage. Entirely up to you. Moving on to spells, we have access to a few different things here still. We are at level 2. I quite like grabbing Hold Person as an option here, as well as something like Blindness. You know, just take some powerful utility spells for this kind of level of the game. But mainly we are here for the feat. Now, whatever you picked, either Intelligence or Charisma to be your level 17 score, or your 17 score, you have a few options here. We have basically all of the Tasha's spells down here, which can help bump up one of our mental stats. Your options are Fey Touched, Shadow Touched, Telepathic, or Telekinetic. All of these work. In my testing, I did use Fey Touched because I did think it is the most powerful overall, allowing me to bump up my Charisma to an 18, as well as take a spell from the Divination Enchantment School of Magic, as well as getting access to Misty Step as well. So it's 2 spells in 1.5 feat ability score improvement, which is really nice. I ended up going for Command, as I felt it was quite a powerful spell that fit nicely with the build, so I decided to grab that here. Moving on to Wizard level 5, we gain access to level 3 spells, finally, which opens up our choices quite a bit. And there are 2 spells that I immediately want to grab for the Great Old One theming here, and that is Psionic Blast and Pulse Wave. Basically, these are 2 force-based psychic blasts, which allow you to do different things. Psionic Blast unleashes a destructive wave of mental power that pushes away all creatures and objects, knocking them prone. This happens in an area around you, and is not something you can really control, so you do have to watch out for your allies. However, it is an evocation spell, so actually your allies won't even take any damage from this, so yeah, basically just spam this wherever. But, however, there's also Pulse Wave, which does a similar thing, but it's a concentrated area that you get to control a bit more, and it creates an intense pressure that you can either use to push or pull enemies towards you. If you think taking both of these is overkill and really you only need one or the other, then feel free to ignore taking both, but I like taking both because they're both fun. They both deal, one does 5d8 force damage and the other does 66, so you'll have to weigh your options in each encounter, but I think it's nice to have both available. And in fact, I will be taking both, because they're fun. Moving on to Wizard level 6, we're going to get the Potent Cantrip feature. Your cantrips become harder to evade entirely. When a creature succeeds its saving throw against one of your cantrips, it still takes half the cantrip's damage, but suffers no additional effects. This doesn't do much for us. Obviously, Eldritch Blast is not a saving throw, it is an attack roll, so really, our main cantrip isn't really going to be benefiting from this. However, other cantrips we could potentially take could, so, you know, it's not like a nothing kind of feature, but it's not something we're going to be making active use of. Anyways, moving on to our spells. Another level 3 spell that I found fun for this build is Summon Shadowspawn, which allows us to summon a Shadow Spear of Fury, Despair, or Fear. I usually summon the Fear one, as that's more in play with what we're going for here. And overall, it's really fun. It's spooky, it feels very dark magic-y, it adds another player onto the battlefield, which is always a good thing, so it is my personal choice here. And then for the other, I took Counterspell, because again, one of the best utility spells in the game. So I think I'll go with this, and this. At level 7 of Wizard, we're going to gain access to level 4 spells, giving us quite a few evocation options to pick from. My main one that I went for here was Gravity Sinkhole, which felt very on theme with the build. Deals 5d10 force damage, and it creates a sphere of crushing force that pulls enemies towards it. So basically, you can group up enemies away from you, and then start hitting them with Eldritch Blasts from afar. It does take a con save, and targets will take half damage if they succeed, and obviously con saves are pretty easy for late game enemies to succeed. However, I do think this is a good spell to have in your repertoire, and it just fits the build perfectly. For your other choice of spell here, it's really up to you. There are a few interesting options here that I will point out. Obviously, Fireball exists, and it's a powerful evocation spell, as well as Ice Storm. But you can also grab Fire Shield, which actually is also an evocation spell. And I think the cold variant, kind of like the chill of the sea, if we're thinking of like great old ones on like the sea and that classic kind of Cthulhu mythos, kind of fits well for this build. And because it is a evocation spell, that damage that gets thrown back at enemies will be affected by some features that I'll be showing off a bit later. And it does give you resistance to your chosen damage type, and it is just extra damage if something does manage to hit you. But again, it's kind of like if something hits you, it's because of a high AC, that might not happen all the time. So kind of feel free to play around with your spell choice here. Again, there are a lot of different things you could go for, but I think I'll just go for these two options for now. And I would say let's replace this with this. At Wizard level 8, we're going to gain access to more spells. Again, pick your favourite. I've said it enough times. Let's grab Fireball because it's Fireball, and I like Ice Storm as a potential damage and battlefield control option. Again, entirely up to you what you want to pick. And we also do get another feat at this point. I would say at this point you definitely want to start bumping up that intelligence to make sure all of your stuff is going to go off. We prioritise charisma because of Eldritch Blast, but at the end of the day we do now have a large repertoire of intelligence-based things, so I think bumping up our intelligence here does make sense. At Wizard level 9, we're going to gain access to level 5 spells, and again, this gives us a lot of interesting options. There are a few that you can grab that feel on theme for the build. One of the better evocation spells, if you don't mind using your concentration, is Immolation for just a massive amount of fire damage on multiple turns. There's also obviously the powerful utility spells like Dominate Person and Hold Monster, which are always great to have. Cone of Cold, another powerful evocation spell. But I quite like picking up a bit of a weird choice here, and it is Macabre Explosion. This feels very, very kind of like in that dark magic realm, with dealing 4d8 necrotic and force damage by bursting this energy forth from a corpse or an undead body. So undead enemies are going to have a very bad time against us, but if you've already killed a target, which let's be honest, you're using Eldritch Blast, you're definitely likely to do so, you get to cause a big explosion of two separate damage types which are not often resisted, force more so than necrotic, which I think is kind of a fun thing. No, it's not an evocation spell, but who cares? It fits the build very, very well. Another spell that isn't an evocation spell, but I also think benefits the build, is Big Beast Hand. It's another thing you can summon. It feels like an evolution of Mage Hand, which again you could say is empowered by this dark spellbook. And as well as it can basically punch enemies, push them, and even grapple them, holding them in place. So I think it has a lot of fun utility that fits the kind of more wizardy vibe that we're also going for here. I think I'm actually going to take both. At level 10 of Wizard, we get something extremely important to the build, and that makes an excellent capstone: Empowered Evocation. Your grasp of evocation magic has tightened, and you can use your add your intelligence modifier to damage rolls of any evocation spells. Note that that doesn't say leveled evocation spell, meaning that this works with cantrips as well. So now Eldritch Blast is gaining a bonus not only off of our charisma, but our intelligence as well, which is a very nice buff indeed. We do get to pick another cantrip, I don't know, take Firebolt I guess, and then finally we do have access to a couple more spells of your choice, really. Whatever you want at this point, we've got everything that we need. We have Evard's Black Tentacles, which would definitely fit into the Great Old One theme, as well as something like Phantasmal Killer, but I think we might as well take a powerful utility spell at this point, or maybe something like Fear as well, but I like Hold Monster in most situations, and I would say definitely have that equipped. And that is the build. Overall, you're mostly a wizard. You have all of the great spell casting capabilities that wizards get. You have access to spell scrolls as a result, which is fun. The only thing we're missing here is level 6 spells because of our 2 levels of Warlock, but again, those 2 levels of Warlock are providing us with a full power Eldritch Blast that we get to take full advantage of, as well as these 2 level 1 spell slots, which are great for utility and resource management. Not to mention our choice of feats allows us more powerful and helpful utility spells, and again, our Eldritch Blast is going to be doing absolutely massive damage, with being able to one-shot single enemy targets in the late game even, which is very, very fun. Not to mention we have a ton of battlefield control options that also deal damage. We have a summon to top it all off, and we have the ever-powerful darkness spell as a way to make it so that we're even harder to hit. We just have so much going on for us here. Obviously, though, the big weakness of this build is the fact that we only have 77 HP, and obviously because of our lower concentration, our concentration spells may have a bit of trouble. But again, the whole point of this build is not being hit, because even without Mage Armour, we have a 19 in AC. So I'm going to quickly cast Mage Armour to show this off. I'm going to turn around for me, mate, so we can get back on the right angle. There we go. We now have 22 AC. I'll explain where that extra AC I promised you at the start of the build went in a moment. But first of all, let's have a look at the equipment. My staff of choice is an early game staff, the Spell Sparkler. Normally I recommend this as an early game option in my magic builds for that you would eventually swap out for something else later. But on this build, actually, I'd recommend keeping this one around. Of course, you have the option to upgrade to something like the Marker Heshkir, or whatever you like when you hit Act 3, but the Spell Sparkler actually has some cool interactions on this build. Whenever the wearer deals damage with a spell or a cantrip, they gain 2 lightning charges. I accidentally short-rested there. Whoops. But basically, lightning charges allow you to have a +1 to attack rolls and deal an additional 1 lightning damage with each hit. Eldritch Blast hits 3 times, meaning you're going to be quickly gaining lightning charge stacks, and as soon as you hit with 1 Eldritch Blast, all of a sudden you now have a +1 to your spell's damage and attack rolls, which is something mostly only gained from late game staffs, which I think is actually really interesting. Not to mention that that extra lightning damage is going to apply to all of our Eldritch Blasts, which I think is quite cool, all 3 beams. As well as the fact that once we gain 5 charges, the next time you deal damage, you deal an additional 1d8 lightning damage on that attack, then you lose all the charges. But then you immediately build them back up again because of Eldritch Blast, so you're constantly going to have extra damage and a higher chance to hit, as well as getting these big extra bursts of damage every turn or 2. So I think lightning charges with the Spell Sparkler combined with Eldritch Blast are going to work super well overall, which is why I recommend it here. Combining this with the Adamantine Shield, another early game shield option, I mean, this is kind of your standard +2 shield for the most part, but it does protect you from critical hits, which will make you a bit tankier despite your lower HP. And as well, if you are missed with a melee attack, which is going to happen often, so if a melee attack misses you, the attacker will be sent reeling, giving them a -1 penalty to attack rolls, making them even less likely to hit you with subsequent attacks. So this, combined with our high AC, all our enemy has to do is miss once, and then technically we now have an AC up to 25 before things like shield. So overall, it's actually pretty damn cool, and I think the combination of these 2 early game items is powerful even up until the late game. Moving on to our ranged weapon slot, you don't need anything in your ranged weapon slot for this build, but when you reach Act 3, there's no reason not to slap the Dead Shot on here just to give you a reduced critical hit rate, which again for Eldritch Blast is really, really nice. It just means that all of our attacks have a chance to crit on a 19 or higher, and the more likely you crit, the more likely Mordant Reminder goes off, and the more likely you are to deal max damage, so you might as well. We're not proficient in it, but so that means we can't really use it as a bow, so to speak, but we still gain the improved critical benefit, so it's worth having around. And besides, we're not really going to use a bow to attack when we have Eldritch Blast. For our headpiece, we do have the Birthright Cap, giving you a +2 to Charisma up to 22, which is how we're going to have our Charisma at its capstone, which I think works out quite nicely. For the early game, though, there's not really too many options really available to you. I do like picking up the Marksmanship Hat in Act 2, however, which will give you a +1 bonus to your ranged attack rolls, which Eldritch Blast counts as. so that could help. There's also some simple things like the haste helm just to give you momentum so that you can easily position yourself. There's a lot of like kind of generic early game equipment that could work, but as soon as you hit Act 3, you're going to be going for the birthright. Moving on, we have the Cloak of Protection here, which is just going to give us a +1 to our AC and a +1 to our saving throws, which will help with our concentration a little bit. Now in Act 2, yep, we're grabbing the Potent Robe, allowing our cantrips to deal additional damage equal to our Charisma modifier, so that's Agonizing Blast times 2 for Eldritch Blast, which is also why we wanted our Charisma so high, and why I didn't just take Eldritch Blast from something like Spell Sniper and then have it work with our Intelligence. We still needed Charisma for this build. We also, at the beginning of the wearer's turn, the robe activates, granting them temporary HP equal to our Charisma modifier, so we're still getting a little bit of that Fiend Warlock kind of vibe with that as well, and it's also a +1 to our Armour class overall. Basically, the best robe in the game for this build, no question. As you already know, the Gloves of Dexterity are here to set our Dexterity score to 18, but it does give us a +1 to our attack rolls, which is what that attack +1 means, so hey, we take those. And finally, there's not really a shoe option that I would openly recommend for this build. The Boots of Speed, the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, they all work, but the Evasive Shoes are going to give us even more AC, so that's why I've chosen them for this build. Moving on, we have the Spine Shudder Amulet. Whenever the wearer deals damage with a ranged spell attack, you inflict 2 turns of reverberation upon the target. Reverberation is just a little bit of extra thunder damage every couple of turns and could possibly knock an enemy prone, but the affected entity, while they're affected by reverberation, will have a -1 penalty to strength, dex, and con saves. So if we attack with Eldritch Blast, building up that range spell, building up reverberation, they'll have a harder time making saves against things like Fireball, or Pulse Wave, or Gravity Sinkhole, and such like that. So, and even we can attack enemy spellcasters to reduce their chances of maintaining concentration. So overall, it's a nice little buff. Moving on, we have the Eversight Ring. This is what's going to make us immune to blindness, which means we can operate in our own darkness without worry. And finally, a ring I've never shown off on the channel before, the Ring of Twilight. You gain a +1 bonus to your armor class while obscured. This is definitely a niche pick. Technically, the Ring of Protection is just a straight upgrade to this if we're talking strictly in terms of AC, but a lot of people don't like to do the quest to get that ring because it invokes like kind of making a bad decision in Act 1 or an evil decision. So if you want to pick that up, you can, but the Ring of Twilight is a fun little interaction I've never got to show off because it gives you a +1 to your armor class while obscured. Again, if we're sitting on our Cloud of Darkness, we're obscured, meaning that the Ring of Twilight will go off for a total of 23 AC. So yeah, overall it's a decent set of equipment. As for my camp clothing, we're using Fear Taylor's camp clothing mod once again, going for the Mage V4, which does give us Disguise Self, but we don't need to use that, as well as Jaheira's boots, which technically do give us Misty Steps, but also we won't be using that, as I don't like using the spells from these armors. I think it's a bit cheaty, so we just take those off the hotbar. But it's pretty good for the fashion. We just get this kind of nice looking cloak, which I did colour in the Emperor dye. And I think that the Emperor is kind of a fun, and like the Dream Visitor is kind of a fun representation of like the Great Old One in this character's backstory. So you can kind of reflavor the lore of this game a little bit, but it does give us this nice deep purple, almost Illithid-like kind of thing, which I think fits the build quite nicely. Speaking of Illithids though, the Tadpole powers, while I've not exclusively recommended any of them in this build, obviously with a build like this, it makes a hell of a lot of sense to take them. So if you want to go for an Illithid power run with this build, absolutely do so, as I do think it is a very fun way to kind of extend this build's gameplay with other unique and fun abilities. It would definitely feel like a dark magic type build if you kind of lean into that aspect of yourself, especially if you go for the partial Illithid in Act 3 and you start to look more and more evil as the dark magic begins to take hold. Yeah, I think that'll be pretty fun. But obviously, that's an optional thing. I didn't want to use them for testing unless the build specifically requires them, so I didn't include them in this build specifically. But again, I think they're a good addition. But yeah, that is it for this video. I mean, overall, I really like this build. Again, a bit more power buildy than I'm used to, but I kind of like the idea of going for like this dark magic theme, kind of mixing the Great Old One with the Wizard. I mean, I never have really mixed Warlock and Wizard properly, and I do think this is a fun combination, so I'm quite happy to include it on the channel here. As for like end of video stuff, I apologize for the lack of videos lately. It's been a combination of a lack of motivation, a lack of sleep, and a lack of health, as I've been ill again this past week, and it's made things very, very tricky. I've also just been busy with life in general, but I do have an extra special upload coming up soon. As I said, the full Call of Cthulhu one-shot I did, Scooby-Doo Murder at Mystery Manor, will be uploaded to the channel either the same day this video goes up or the next day. Probably the next day, most likely, because it's a very long video. It's 8 hours long. So, but it is a super fun time, so I really do hope you guys check that out if you get the chance. Alright, that is going to do it for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.